In this video, we'll talk about France's expulsion from yet another African nation, why this is happening, and who is filling the vacuum left by French forces in that region. France's history in Africa begins in the 19th century, when the French started establishing small colonies on the African coast to exploit resources like slaves and ivory. However, it was in the 19th century that this expansion took shape and was formalized, especially after the Berlin Conference between 1884 and 1885, which formalized the division of Africa among the main European powers of that time. France sought to ensure access to natural resources and markets for its products while consolidating its global power. Therefore, colonies like Congo, Senegal, Ivory Coast, and Gabon became crucial in this scenario. At its peak, the French colonial empire encompassed over 10 million square kilometers, covering much of West and Central Africa, a territory larger than the current area of Brazil. During that period, more than 50 million people lived under French administration, equivalent to over half of the entire African population in the 19th century, a gigantic population mass that was maximally exploited by the French metropolis. With all this economic exploitation and cultural imposition, local resistances emerged, with rebellions like that of the Mandingo people in Mali showing that French control was not absolute. World War II marked the beginning of the end for the empire, with independence movements gaining strength, driven by local leaders and international pressure. Thus, in 1960, known as Africa's Year, most French colonies in Africa achieved independence. However, France maintained influence through the Françafrique system, which combined economic agreements, diplomatic ties, and military presence. This system was based on a network of African elites trained in France who maintained close ties with Paris. France offered financial and military support to these leaders in exchange for political loyalty and privileged access to natural resources. Despite ensuring stability for French interests, Françafrique was criticized for perpetuating inequalities and dependency, with many African governments participating in the system accused of corruption and human rights violations, fueling popular dissatisfaction that eventually led to anti-French movements in various regions. Why was Ivory Coast so important to France? After its independence in 1960, Ivory Coast became France's main ally in the region. Its role as the world's largest cocoa exporter, combined with a stable economy and advanced infrastructure, made the country a pillar for French interests in West Africa. During the Civil War between 2002 and 2007, France directly intervened to protect civilians and support pacification operations, with this intervention reinforcing and expanding the French military presence in the country. Located in Abidjan, the Port Bouet military base symbolized the close partnership between the two countries, with around 600 French soldiers providing logistical support, military training, and direct action against local and foreign threats. This base also served as a strategic point for French operations throughout the region, strengthening Paris's control over West Africa. However, on December 31, 2024, President Alassane Ouattara announced nationally that French troops must leave the country by the end of January 2025, highlighting that his army had reached a level of modernization that no longer required the presence of foreign troops, stating that now his own forces are fully capable of ensuring the country's sovereignty and security. Nevertheless, the withdrawal of French troops from Ivory Coast should be understood within a broader context, involving deep historical resentment and modern discontent with French influence in the region. Since the colonial period, France has been accused of economically exploiting its territories, subjugating local populations, and imposing cultural and political structures that completely favored Paris's interests. In the contemporary era, this colonial legacy has turned into a sentiment of revolt against what is seen as neo-colonialism, with the French military presence increasingly perceived as a means to continue exerting control over African countries at the expense of national sovereignty. Popular protests and inflammatory political speeches throughout the region have strengthened this narrative. In Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, grassroots movements and local leaders have mobilized populations to demand the withdrawal of French troops, creating a domino effect that has now reached Ivory Coast. President Ouattara, despite historically being a great ally of France, made this decision also as a way to respond to popular demands and reaffirm the country's autonomy, especially at a moment when the modernization of the Ivorian army was showcased as a milestone of independence and progress. The French withdrawal has left a security vacuum in regions like the Sahel, where jihadist groups have increased their activities, with local governments struggling to contain the violence without external military support. It was in this context of the vacuum left by France that Russian presence in West Africa intensified, with Moscow seeking to increase its global influence, especially in regions where Western powers have reduced their presence. The Wagner Group, a mercenary company connected to the Russian government, has played a central role in this expansion in Mali, Burkina Faso, and other Sahel countries. These mercenaries offer military training and direct support against jihadist insurgencies. However, reports of human rights violations and civilian massacres raise serious concerns about the cost of this collaboration. Moreover, the performance of Russian mercenary forces is seen as far inferior to that of the French forces, leading to a dangerous increase in jihadist presence in the African Sahel. For Russia, this region is strategic not only militarily but also economically, with access to natural resources like gold and uranium motivating its growing presence. Beyond Russia, China has increased its economic investments in the area, seeking influence through infrastructure and trade projects that include railways, ports, airports, and power plants, often financed by loans that increase African countries' dependence on Beijing. Regional powers like Nigeria and South Africa also attempt to occupy space by promoting greater cooperation among African countries and strengthening organizations like ECOWAS. The decline of the French military presence in West Africa marks the end of an era that began at the height of colonialism and now gives way to new power dynamics. The region faces complex challenges, but also opportunities to build a more independent and sovereign future. However, Russia's entry seems to indicate that African nations are merely replacing one colonial power with another rapidly expanding colonial power. If you're not yet subscribed to the channel, subscribe now and turn on notifications so you don't miss any updates.